this sentence right here is it's a fallacious way of arguing. If anything, this is actually called poisoning the well. I see a lot of people on Twitter use this. It's really bad. This is not how you argue. This is a horrible argument because he's essentially discrediting any future attempts of actually critiquing his movie here. So as mentioned, this is actually a very good counter argument to this sort of a statement, because essentially what he's trying to say, or what the other Resident Evil directors have also been trying to say, is that just because they say that they're fans, that automatically gives them credibility to be able to make a faithful adaptation. But obviously that's not the case. And as mentioned, that content creator, Mikado, brought up a very good counter argument, basically saying that, oh, well, all fan fiction writers are huge fans of whatever series, games, or movies that they're writing off of, but that doesn't necessarily mean that their project is good, which, as mentioned, is a fantastic argument. So in today's video, I'm actually going to be going over my thoughts on what the new Resident Evil director basically stated in regards to his new Resident Evil Reboot movie that's releasing next year. But the first thing that I want to state when it comes to Resident Evil movies is that there's a lot of Resident Evil movies that are okay if you shut the part of your brain that kind of has all of the Resident Evil lore and all of the Resident Evil logic. It basically goes out the window, and if you can do that and shut off your brain, then it's kind of like a dumb, fun, Resident Evil movie, or just a movie at that point. But on the flip side, there's also a ton of Resident Evil movies that are completely illogical and have actually done major damage to the Resident Evil brand. To name a few, we have Resident Evil Extinction, Resident Evil The Final Chapter, and the Netflix Resident Evil reboot that we just recently had back in, I think, 2022. Honestly, I never want to hear or even watch that show ever again. It was such a disaster. And they put over, I think $100 million into that. I think that's the highest, if I'm not mistaken. Well, I guess for a show or a one-off thing. But it's worth noting that even though I just mentioned 3 movies that have done major damage to the Resident Evil brand, that's not the only damage that was done. If anything, I would argue that all of the Resident Evil live action movies, since we're not talking about the CGI, they are part of the actual canon of Resident Evil, if you guys didn't know. But when it comes to the live actions, they've all done a horrific job of actually showcasing to the general public what Resident Evil is. If anything, it's brought in a lot of misconceptions, a lot of confusion to the public. And even in my case, as a Resident Evil content creator, whenever somebody that I know personally, whether it's a coworker or somebody that I've met, and they find out that I do Resident Evil content on YouTube, and especially if they have no prior knowledge to Resident Evil, if I tell them that I'm a Resident Evil YouTuber, a lot of them will say, oh yeah, I know Resident Evil, I've watched a lot of the movies. And it's I don't know how to explain that that it has nothing to do with the Resident Evil games. If anything, a lot of the Resident Evil movies are in their own freaking or universe, and the only thing that kind of connects them is just random character cameos and just the logo, basically, just the name of Resident Evil. And for those of you that don't know, and you might be asking yourself, well, why is it the case that we've had so many Resident Evil live action movies that have not been faithful? Well, that all stems, and it's all because of a German production company called Constantine Films, who are the sole rights owners to the Resident Evil live action kind of franchise, right? They're the only ones that are allowed to basically make movies out there, because they're the only ones that bought it off of Capcom. So it doesn't matter which movie it is. It doesn't matter if it's the Paul W.S. Anderson movies, the Johannes Roberts Welcome to Raccoon City, or the Netflix Resident Evil show. All of those live action Resident Evil movies have all had the same production company. And that's basically why they've all been completely trash. But that kind of begs the question, why is Constantine Films trying again and again and again to kind of make a Resident Evil adaptation? And the reason for that is because of Paul W.S. Anderson. His movies, I guess 6 of his movies, have all made a combined total of $1.2 billion, which is insane. And it's worth noting that a lot of that money was actually made from the international market, or AKA the international box office. So that's basically the answer. The reason we keep getting really bad Resident Evil adaptations is because it already worked for Constantine Films from 2002 is when the first Milla Jovovich, and I think the last one was 20, bro, I don't even remember, man. I think 2012, I don't know. I'm gonna have to fact check myself, but anyways, and that's why we've actually had 2 Resident Evil reboots so far, and now they're trying a 3rd time. So that's kind of just brings us all to speed as to the whole history of why Resident Evil movies have not been good. Now, it is worth noting too that the difference here is that obviously they're bringing in a new director, but I've also seen a lot of misconception out there in the community when the news kind of broke that this was going to happen. For instance, is that I've seen this kind of idea a misconception kind of stating that, oh, this movie is going to be different because it's a different production company, because it was confirmed that Sony was going to be the production company involved with this movie. But it's worth noting that Sony was also a part of the other Resident Evil movies, a lot of them, if not all. I'm pretty sure Welcome to Raccoon City and all of the Paul W.S. Anderson movies was also produced by Screen Gems, which is a subsidiary for Sony Films or whatever, Sony Productions. I don't know the official title, but all that to say is that Sony has been already a part of all of this. So it's not new. This does not mean that we're going to get something new. But now that everybody is up to speed with the Resident Evil lore or movie lore, let's actually get started and look at this director's new statement, because there's a lot of issues here. But horror director Zach Cregger is currently working on a big screen adaptation of Resident Evil, but has warned gamers that they might hate it. At the start of the year, it was announced that Barbarian creator Zach Cregger was working on a faithful Resident Evil reboot film that would take the franchise back to its horror roots. So anyways, Zach basically says that I'm a gigantic Resident Evil fan and I've played them all. He said in an interview with SFX magazine, I don't know how many times I've just looped Resident Evil 4 again and again. I just love it. All right, so we gotta stop right there and actually make a statement here. This is actually not good news. This, I would actually say, is a huge red flag, especially when we're talking about Resident Evil, because a version of this has actually been said by every Resident Evil director to date. You can even go back to the Netflix Resident Evil show, where they actually showcased a video with the producers and the writers, all basically stating that they hired Resident Evil experts or lore experts. And after watching that show, that was rough to hear. That was just a flat out lie. Not to mention, Johannes Roberts also came out to say that, who was the director of Welcome to Raccoon City, the first Resident Evil reboot that they tried, and also Paul W.S. Anderson, or aka the director or the husband of Mila Jovovich, for those Resident Evil movies. They have all gone on record saying that they're major Resident Evil fans. Him saying that he's a fan doesn't give him any credibility. As mentioned, we've had every other director basically state that they've been fans. And that kind of reminds me of a very good argument that I recently watched, I think roughly around 2 months ago, from a fellow YouTuber by the name of Mikado, who was critiquing a new Legend of Zelda movie that's actually being made. And funny enough, that director said the same thing. He basically said that he was a fan of the games, and she brought up a very good argument that I'm just going to basically read it out because I think it was really great. She basically stated, just because you happen to be a big fan of something doesn't mean that whatever you create based off of that work is guaranteed to be good. That's like saying every fan fiction is good because everyone who writes fan fictions is a huge fan of whatever series, games, or characters they're writing about, end quote. So as mentioned, this is actually a very good counter argument to this sort of a statement, because essentially what he's trying to say, or what the other Resident Evil directors have also been trying to say, is that just because they say that they're fans, that automatically gives them credibility to be able to make a faithful adaptation. But obviously that's not the case. And as mentioned, that content creator, Mikado, brought up a very good counter argument, basically saying that, oh, well, all fan fiction writers are huge fans of whatever series, games, or movies that they're writing off of, but that doesn't necessarily mean that their project is good, which, as mentioned, is a fantastic argument. By the way, if you guys are enjoying the content and you guys want me to make more of this, then let me know by leaving a like and also sharing the video. Just in case you guys didn't know, I am a very small content creator, and of course, having more subscribers does help me book more interviews like the ones you guys have seen on the channel, where I speak to very famous voice actors. It would also help me get more collabs with bigger content creators so we can all hang out while I'm streaming a discussion with them. And it also gets me more invitations to special events, so I'm able to cover more stuff for you guys. But anyways, let's get back to the video, and thank you to everyone that's supporting the channel. But anyways, let's actually continue down. And he basically states, despite being a fan, he admitted that he's definitely not trying to be completely obedient to the lore of the games. Okay, so we definitely have to stop right here. For starters, this is incredibly contradictory, because as a fan of the series, why wouldn't you want to be completely obedient to the lore of the games? That seems incredibly contradictory. If you're such a huge fan of Resident Evil and somebody gave you the keys and gave you a bunch of money to make a Resident Evil movie, why on earth would you go against the game's logic, the game's history, or in other words, the lore? That right there is a huge red flag, and it's incredibly contradictory. Anyways, he goes on to say for his movie, and he later states, I'm trying to tell a story that just feels authentic to the experience you get when you play the games. Okay, this is a huge red flag. So I think that's very subjective to try to get the experience that you get from playing the games. And if he's already stated that he's not going to be obedient to the lore of the games, then he's just making another Mila Jovovich, another, you know what I mean, just original nonsense kind of a movie, which is really bad. Anyways, he goes on to say, I don't think I'm breaking any major rules. Well, okay, that's a huge contradiction, because if you're saying that you don't think you're breaking any major rules, but you just stated that you're not going to be obedient to the rule of the games, you're just basically going to throw all of that history out the window. That's incredible. You are breaking major rules. What do you mean? Like, what fan would actually do that? Like, most fans want to go around, you know, the already established logic to the story or the lore of the games in this instance, right? So what? But I also recognize that no matter what I do, people are going to come for me online. Anyways, I actually grabbed the full quote in this article Cregger said, but I also recognize that no matter what I do, people are going to come for me online. So all I want to do is make a really good movie and tell a story that's good. Okay, wait a second. Let's go back a couple steps, because this right here, this sentence right here is it's a fallacious way of arguing. If anything, this is actually called poisoning the well. I see a lot of people on Twitter use this. It's really bad. This is not how you argue. This is a horrible argument, because he's essentially discrediting any future attempts of actually critiquing his movie here. So it basically makes this argument a poisoning the well fallacy, because this right here, he basically says that people are going to come for me online no matter what I do, which is a huge, as mentioned, it basically discredits any future criticisms. So as a Resident Evil fan, especially when I'm trying to kind of look, you know, the whole movie as a whole and trying to give valid criticisms, this all gets thrown out the window because he's doing this logical fallacy. It's another example of this logical fallacy is you'll see this kind of argument being said a lot in like schools as a kid in elementary or whatever. Kids will say, if anybody doesn't believe what I'm saying, you're an idiot. You're essentially sabotaging any arguments to be made, which doesn't mean that you've won the argument, because as mentioned, somebody could say, well, wait a second, I don't believe you because of this reason, this reason, this reason, that's all valid. But just because the person said that, oh, they're idiots. Or in this case, this guy is basically saying that people are going to come for me online, almost as if there's just the group of angry Resident Evil fans that are just unhinged, which is super, as mentioned, that's not a good argument, because a lot of Resident Evil fans are actually going to look at this movie, they're going to watch it. And the fact that he's using these kinds of arguments, as mentioned, it's not a good argument because it's a logical fallacy, but the fact that he's doing that, it's very telling to the kind of movie he's already thinking of making, because one can ascertain with everything that he's actually stated, one can ascertain that he's already going to do something completely just out there that has nothing to do with Resident Evil. You know what I mean? Like, you can see right here, it says, I'm definitely not trying to be completely obedient to the lore of the games. I'm trying to tell a story that just feels authentic to the experience when you play the game. That's a huge cop-out. He's basically trying to say that he doesn't know the games, and he doesn't want to take the time to actually study the lore of the games or hire somebody that actually does know. And if anything, he's just going to tell a random story that he feels from his personal experience that this is Resident Evil enough. And hopefully people watch it, right? He says, I don't think I'm breaking any major rules here, Cregger said. All I want to do is make a really good movie and tell a story that's compelling. I know I'm going to be proud of it, and hopefully others will be too. Right here, he's kind of doubling down. He says, I know I'm going to be proud of the movie that I make, even though everybody hates it. So I'm not going to take any criticisms from anybody. Is basically what he's trying to say. I guess my final thoughts on all of this is that this is really bad, guys. This director is making a lot of poor excuses. He's using, you know, that really poor logical fallacy of poisoning the well, since he's well aware that a lot of Resident Evil fans are really pissed off with Constantine films. Maybe Constantine films kind of told them, hey, watch out for this, which I think is, if that's the case, that's incredibly dumb, because as mentioned, this is going to be the third time Constantine Films is rebooting Resident Evil. And the fact that they still haven't learned that, hey, let's actually make a faithful video game adaptation. Let's not go the route of making an original movie, because I have seen this idea kind of going around in the Resident Evil community on Twitter or whatnot, where people are kind of suggesting that, oh, this is awesome. They should do the same thing that Fallout is doing. No, they should not do an original story with the game's lore. Not at all. When it comes to Resident Evil, it's such an easy story to tell. It should not be hard for Hollywood directors to actually make a good like a good video game adaptation off of it. You know what I mean? So it's that I don't think that they should ever touch this original making the games or making an original story off of it. I guess you could also make the counter argument that perhaps Constantine Films thought that Johannes Roberts, aka the director of Welcome to Raccoon City's version, was closer to the games, even though that was all a complete lie. All of it was just an original retelling. What's funny too, and this is something that I talked about heavily when the movie came out, is that movie suffered from a horrible retelling because they basically combined Resident Evil 1 story with Resident Evil 3 or Resident Evil 2 story, which makes absolutely no sense. You ask any fan, they'll tell you that the timeline between those two makes zero sense. They should have done Resident Evil 2 and Resident Evil 3 story together and maybe make Resident Evil 1 later. But yeah, really bad. Really stupid. I would actually say don't buy tickets to this movie. I'm going to be covering it since I'm a Resident Evil YouTuber. I'll make sure to let you guys know next year when the movie releases. Click this video if you guys want to see the previous video where I talked about this movie, and click this video right here if you guys want to watch my recent Resident Evil Mind video. Anyways, thank you so much for watching.